Huh? T-34s have scored a lot of kills. Okay, well, I bet Rotmistrov's really happy. What? Why not? What do you mean they're German T-34s? Oh, yeah, that changes things, yeah. You've weathered the Soviet storm, inflicting far greater casualties on the enemy than he has on you. You've assembled your armored spearheads, and now it's time to strike at Prokhorovka. You are Paul Hauser, and your order to the Totenkopf division this afternoon is Panzer Marsch! I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II in real-time mini-series on the Battle of Prokhorovka. Last time, scores of Soviet T-34s threatened to overrun German positions on Hill 252.2, but were brought to a halt by an anti-tank ditch and devastating defensive fire. On the left flank, elements of two Soviet tank brigades bypassed German defenses at Oktyabrski State Farm, but were stopped by mighty Tiger tanks, and a small Soviet infiltration group briefly held Komsomolets State Farm, but was encircled and annihilated. I'll start today by looking at the battle on the flanks, starting north of the river Psel with the Totenkopf division. Earlier today, they get all their armor across the river and begin their assault on Hill 226.6. Somewhere between noon and 1 p.m., they seize the heights and push the Soviet 95th Guards Division back to the eastern slopes of the hill. Units of the 11th Motorized Rifle Brigade continue fighting for a few hours, but as the brigade's political officer records, the enemy succeeded in breaking into the depths of our defense with tanks and motorized infantry, and in developing the offensive with attacks on our front, flanks, and rear. For the next 2 hours, the 2nd and 3rd Motorized Rifle Battalions fought in complete encirclement, while the 1st Motorized Rifle Battalion struggled in semi-encirclement. Numerically small and weakened by the breakdown of weapons, the brigade was compelled under the cover of artillery to withdraw from the fight. While he notes that the men display high political spirit and morale, he also condemns several officers for their cowardice and incompetence. Well, after crushing the Soviet defenders on the hill, the SS also makes some attacks north to the eastern outskirts of Veselye and towards Hill 236.7. But the main event will be a massive drive northeast, aiming a panzer wedge between Polezhayev and the hill. The ultimate goal is still to cut the Prokhorovka-Kartashevka road, occupy the high ground to the northwest of the town, and start hitting the Soviets in the flanks. I have not yet talked about the fighting between Alexei Berdany's 2nd Guards Tank Corps and the SS Das Reich Panzer Division on the other end of the battlefield. There isn't really much change in the lines here, but it's worth talking about because there are some interesting moments, and because, as ineffective as the Soviet attacks are, they do prevent Das Reich from making more than limited advances. Berdany actually lost one of his tank brigades even before the battle started. In the early hours of the morning, he sent his 26th Guards Tank Brigade, along with Tank Army Commander Pavel Rotmistrov's reserve force, to help deal with Army Detachment Kempf's breakthrough at Vrzhavets. With that, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps lost 44 of their 141 operational tanks. Because of poor coordination, Berdany doesn't actually start his main attack until after 11, by which point Rotmistrov's main attack is already stalling. The tankers of the 25th Guards Tank Brigade are the first to reach the German defenses, hitting the 4th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, their Führer. They do manage to drive them back a bit and capture some woods and the village of Belenichino on the railway. The Germans call in support from their Nebelwerfer batteries at Komsomolets State Farm and Ivanovsky Wieselok, and air support from the Luftwaffe, and so the Soviets are unable to break through to Yasnaya Poliana. The 4th Guards Tank Brigade attacks along the Corps' left flank and also manages to cross the railway. By 2:30 in the afternoon, they're fighting for Kalinin, but they do not have much success. Das Reich's Panzer Regiment reports destroying some 20 Soviet tanks in a couple of hours. The fighting here is pretty close quarters, and the Germans are impressed by the tenacity of the Soviet tankers. We were particularly impressed by the thrust and relentlessness which marked the Soviet forces' attack. However, Again, it was not a coordinated effort. Thus, we were able to shoot one attack after another to pieces. Soviet losses were exorbitant, but this did not serve to diminish the Soviet soldiers' fighting spirit. They really fought with the utmost dedication. I recall one example which I witnessed myself. One T-34 sat ablaze roughly 1,000 feet from our positions. The crew had bailed out. I then noticed how an apparently wounded soldier dragged himself back to the burning tank, got in, and then drove the tank against one of ours. I think the latter was an armored personnel carrier. The Soviet tank exploded upon impact. Here, the Das Reich Division is assisted by elements of the 167th Infantry Division, which is the only army formation in the whole 2nd SS Panzer Corps. When the 4th Guards tanks try and withdraw from Kalinin, they are apparently hit by airstrikes, not just from German dive bombers, but also by their own IL-2 Sturmovix. During this fighting, Das Reich's force of 8 Soviet T-34s is turned against their former owners. The division's history records it as follows. One interesting incident was the employment against the Russians of T-34s, which Das Reich had seized from a factory in Kharkov. During the day, a column of 50 Russian vehicles was seen driving along one of the Balkas, or valleys. On the high ground above the Russian column stood the division's group of T-34s, which opened a destructive fire upon the Russian tanks. The Panzermen's tactic was one which they had learned early in the war with Russia: kill the enemy's command tank first. It was the only machine fitted with both a radio receiver and transmitter. Russian tanks carried on their rear decks a metal drum containing reserve fuel supplies. A hit on the drum ignited the fuel and caused the tank to blow up. Having repulsed the Soviet Tank Corps, Das Reich then goes on the offensive, with part of the Deutschland Regiment advancing into Storojevoye and clearing the Soviet defenders from the southern portion of the village, and another part taking possession of the outskirts of Vinogradovka. By 5 p.m., Das Reich have completed the capture of Storojevoye. North of the river Psel, the Totenkopf division begins their advance to the Prokhorovka-Kartashevka road at around 3 in the afternoon. The division forms its armor into a Panzerkeil, or a tank wedge, with the Tigers in the lead. This is a slow, slogging march, with mines and hidden anti-tank guns to deal with time and time again. But by 6 p.m., they have reached the line from Hill 236.7 to Polezhayev. Parts of the division's armored spearheads have reached the fabled road. This is the high water mark of Hauser's advance. Not only are ammunition and fuel in short supply, but Rotmistrov begins deploying units from his reserve into blocking positions. These are the 24th Guards Tank Brigade and the 10th Guards Mechanized Brigade. They arrive late in the evening, and that is essentially the end of the battle. There are some more skirmishes and probing attacks into the evening and even into the night, but nothing that changes the results of the day. The front line looks something like this. You have the Totenkopf bulge north of the Psel, with the advanced units having reached the Kartashevka-Prokhorovka road. Totenkopf have control over the uplands and have also halted the Soviets at Andreevka. In the center, the Red Army has seized the northern half of the Oktyabrski State Farm, but now the 18th and 29th Corps are essentially positioned far forward at the bottom of a bowl, surrounded by German troops on high ground from Andreevka through Hill 241.6 up to Hill 252.2. On the right flank, Leibstandarte and Das Reich have managed to advance, capturing Stalinsk State Farm and pushing out into the woods beyond Storojevoye. The 167th Infantry Division has also held its lines. But although Rotmistrov hasn't actually managed to break through the German forces, he has halted the 2nd SS Panzer Corps' drive on Prokhorovka. This is in part down to the formidable anti-tank defenses they installed on the slopes of the town itself, which convinced Hauser yesterday that a frontal assault was unfeasible. Still, at the end of today, July 12th, Hauser still hopes that his flanking plan with Totenkopf will work. Smashing the Soviet defenses on Hill 252.4 should allow him to penetrate the town along the road from the northwest. However, although he will try and continue the armored advance tomorrow, his hopes will be dashed when Rotmistrov unleashes the armored units he transfers over there this evening. On the 13th of July, Totenkopf, under heavy pressure, was forced to retreat from the Prokhorovka-Kartashevka road to its 12th of July start lines around Hill 226.6, close to the Psel crossings. As a result, Totenkopf was never able to launch the flanking assault on Hill 252.4 that the Leibstandarte deemed was a prerequisite to its own assault on Prokhorovka. Totenkopf's inability to suppress Hill 252.4's devastating artillery fire meant that any prospect of a serious Leibstandarte assault on Prokhorovka evaporated. Also tomorrow, Adolf Hitler calls a meeting with his two overall commanders here, Field Marshals Gunther von Kluge and Erich von Manstein. Hitler has two pressing matters on his mind. First, the Allied landings on Sicily, Operation Husky, which began a few days ago on the 9th. Hitler is very worried that the Italians cannot be trusted to successfully defend their country against the Western Allies. He also fears that more landings may follow, perhaps on the south coast of France or in the Balkans. So he wants to bring over reliable German troops from the east. Second, Hitler is also worried about the Soviet counteroffensive that was launched yesterday, Operation Kutuzov. This targets the Orel Bulge at the north of the Kursk salient and is part of the general Soviet plan to turn the tables against the Germans around the whole salient. Hitler decides to call off Operation Citadel. 4 days from then, on July 17th, the German Armed Forces High Command orders the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to withdraw from combat and prepare for transfer west. So, is this a win for Rotmistrov? Well, I suppose you could say so. On the most fundamental level, he prevented the enemy from taking Prokhorovka. But beyond that, what did he achieve? He wasn't able to break through the German lines, nor destroy a significant amount of the 2nd Panzer Corps armor. He could have achieved much the same result, for far less cost, by simply maintaining and strengthening his defensive lines, especially as time was working against the Germans anyway from the start of Operation Citadel. Next time, I will look into the enormous losses of armor suffered by the 5th Guards Tank Army during the battle. Who on earth would want to miss that? Exciting stuff like that, and like this, is produced by us thanks to the Time Ghost Army. You too can join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Nicholas Poirier is the Time Ghost Army Prokhorovka pal this week, and these are the newest army officers. Do not forget to subscribe either. See you next time.